Mr Deputy Speaker, I move that we do now leave the chair and the House resolve itself to consider the bill.
Sorry. The question is that this motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those of that opinion, those contrary to that say no. The ayes have it.
Just one moment. For the purpose of the maintenance of social distancing, I shall chair the committee of the whole House from the Speaker's chair, just to be clear. Yeah, where would you like to start?
Madam Chair, in accordance with Standing Order 116, I declare the COVID-19 Disease Emergency Miscellaneous Provisions Bill number 2, 2020 to be an urgent bill.
There's no debate. Just seeking clarification about what that means. If you could provide that, please, Chair.
The question is that the bill be declared an urgent bill. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Those against no. The ayes have it.
Madam Chair, I move that all remaining stages of the bill shall be concluded by, can I just seek advice from the Deputy Clerk? 6:30. By 6:30 p.m. today. I understand we have a 20-minute debate now, if needed, for the members' awareness. With the urgent nature of this bill, necessitated by the government's response to obviously the COVID-19 crisis, this bill is required to move to the Legislative Council as soon as practical. I know that they are waiting on this bill, and also should there need to be anything further that comes back to this House to consider from the Legislative Council in the interest of time, we need to do that today. I do realise the circumstances of this bill. I know that members or non-government members received the bill on Tuesday, but I do know that there have been fairly extensive briefings given, and we have attempted to deal with those matters as thoroughly as possible. And while I appreciate that some members may wish to provide amendments, and certainly we will be moving an amendment, but I will confine my comments to very brief comments in relation to the government's amendment, because I think that I'll deal with most of the reasoning throughout the second reading speech in that regard. I will just, I think, manage in the next hour or so. I know that some amendments may not be necessary anymore, but in the interest of getting this bill through, and this bill is the bill being done today because it is the most urgent and priority bill that we need to get done, not least of all because of the Legislative Council provisions contained in it. I mention that as a specific example because I know that it is very time specific in that regard. So in the interest of not prolonging this, and should members wish to make contributions themselves as well, I will confine my comments to that.
Are you moving the First Amendment?
No, we're just doing the time right now. Just the urgency.
No, we have to move
The question is?
Yeah, Elisa's motion.
The question is? The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Those against no. The ayes have it.
Okay, so
Where do we start?
clause 3 I need to deal with.
Clauses 1 to 2.
the clauses as read stand part of the bill. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Those against, no. The ayes have it.
Clause 3, interpretation.
Oh yes, as I just said, I will be moving an amendment, and that is in relation to clause 3. Page 4, the definition of emergency cessation day. So the amendment is to leave out the definition and instead insert the following definition. Emergency cessation day has the same meaning as in the COVID-19 Disease Emergency Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2020. Now, just briefly in speaking to that, the government's amendment at clause 3 of the bill provides a new definition of emergency cessation day, as I just said. That definition provides that the definition of emergency cessation day is the same as the definition used in the COVID-19 Disease Emergency Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2020. This provides consistency between the two acts. In the bill before us, the definition of emergency cessation day was provided for separately at clause 29. So once the new definition is included at clause 3, that clause will no longer be required. With regard to clause 17, that clause provides that part 6 makes consequential amendments to the already enforce COVID-19 Disease Emergency Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2020. So as I mentioned previously, the government's amendment to clause 3 will provide for consistency between these definitions.
Madam Speaker, just...
Yes.
Just briefly, Madam Speaker, we of course support this amendment. This was in fact our first amendment. It was very important that there be consistency, and I'm encouraged by the fact that the government's amendment has precisely the same wording as ours, which points to the quality of our staff.
Thank you. The question is that the amendment be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no.
Well, it's funny.
I think the ayes have it.
Clause 10.
The clause as amended, the question is that the clause as amended stand part of the bill. Those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it.
Clauses 4 to 9.
The question is that the clauses as read stand part of the bill. Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Those to the contrary, no. The ayes have it.
Clause 10, interpretation and application of part 3.
So,
Yes, the Greens.
Madam Chair, I move that section 10 is amended as followed by inserting in subsection 1 before the definition of the Act the following definition. Committee has the same meaning as in the Public Accounts Committee Act of 1970. Madam Chair, our amendment to clause 10 and to clause 11 provide an oversight, which is coming, provide an oversight mechanism for contracts entered into by the Tasmanian Health Service under this part that are either of a duration exceeding 1 year or of an estimated cost exceeding $20 million. The powers being proposed in the legislation we're debating today are excessive, and we believe they are not reasonable. Our amendment to clause 11, which is coming, is adapted from the Public Works Committee Act of 1914 and provides a framework for these contracts to be scrutinised by the Public Accounts Committee. This is necessary for proper scrutiny of contracts that are able to subvert current processes and law. The recent Integrity Commission report number 4 of 2019 shows how under normal circumstances contract processes can be corrupted. The risks involved when normal requirements are waived without public scrutiny are heightened. We believe the threshold of either a duration exceeding 1 year or of an estimated cost exceeding $20 million is reasonable and should not impede smaller value contracts. And I'm going to take this opportunity, Madam Speaker, while I'm on my feet speaking about scrutiny that's applied to the decisions under the emergency period, to again express my concern that technical arguments are being used to deny the Subordinate Legislation Committee the opportunity to examine directions that are made under the Public Health Act. Now, Madam Speaker, government might view a committee of the Parliament overseeing directions in an emergency as an impediment or a block on executive power or an annoyance, and it may be to the government of the day. But we shouldn't be afraid to allow the Subordinate Legislation Committee to look at directions made by the Director of Public Health, given that they impede on the rights and freedoms of everyday Tasmanians. They restrict who we can spend time with. They restrict our movements. They prevent us from enjoying our parks and beaches. And while we understand these are important measures, they can't be made in a scrutiny vacuum, Madam Speaker. And did you know, Madam Chair, that it is consistent across all Australian and New Zealand jurisdictions, with the exception of Tasmania, that subordinate legislation is regarded as any regulation, order or notice that is made under an Act. And there is no exception in the Public Health Act for directions not to be scrutinised as regulations. We believe that this is a flaw in the scrutiny mechanisms. We were reassured in the debate on the last COVID bill that there were strong oversight and scrutiny mechanisms in place. That does not appear, Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, to be the case. And we should not be denying this extremely powerful oversight committee, if it uses its powers, the opportunity to examine some of the directions that have been made by the Public Health and potentially, Director of Public Health, and potentially to improve them for government. And I refer all members of the House to a legal opinion that has been prepared by Professor Brendan Gogarty and Professor Gabriel Appleby on the role of the Tasmanian Subordinate Legislation Committee during the COVID-19 emergency, which makes it very clear that the Subordinate Legislation Committee is not able to properly scrutinise measures that are being taken during the emergency period. And that is a matter of great regret, because we were somewhat reassured during the debate on the last bill that the Subordinate Legislation Committee would have a strong oversight role, and that does not appear to be the case.
Yes, Minister.
Point. There are certain things that the Subordinate Legislation Committee can't deal with. And that's
Could you please speak up, Attorney?
And that are things that aren't regulations. But specifically in relation to the amendment
directions are regulations. I know you've got some technical advice that says they're not, but they are.
Yeah, well, I'll just deal with your amendment. So Part 3 of the Act clarifies the Tasmanian Health Service can enter into contracts to ensure that hospital and health services may be performed or provided as necessary during the emergency period, either by the THS or by the person being contracted with, such as with THS assistance. These contracts can be subject to the same level of scrutiny as existing THS spending, both through annual reporting and parliamentary oversight. The THS already has broad power to enter contracts in relation to the provision of health and hospital services to Tasmanians, including the purchase of health and hospital services. But these contracts must be consistent with the service plan. The service plan framework is not responsive to the fast-changing needs of COVID-19 emergency. The amendment also facilitates... what we're dealing with here is facilitating the ability of the THS to work even more closely with private hospital and health providers to ensure a coordinated health response. The existing statutory accountability frameworks will continue to enable proper scrutiny of THS spending. For example, the Public Accounts Committee Act 1970 provides the Public Accounts Committee with broad functions to inquire into matters of its own volition or in response to referrals from the House. The THS is a statutory authority within the meaning of the Public Accounts Act. The Secretary as governing authority of the THS, together with the executive members, are also subject to all state service accountability requirements. The committee can inquire into public sector finances matters, which is broadly defined. It includes monies in the public account, monies received or expended by agencies and statutory authorities, or expenditure authorised under any act. The amendment in this bill is already subject to proper scrutiny arrangements and is consistent with the existing statutory purposes of the THS. These are to promote and maintain the health of persons in Tasmania and to ensure the provision of care and treatment to people in Tasmania. Well, I've just been spending a whole page of explaining what the oversight is for the THS and its expenditure. The government won't be supporting this amendment by the Greens. There are checks and balances in place. This bill doesn't change any of those checks and balances or obligations or reporting, and for that reason we won't be supporting the amendment.
Madam Chair,
Yes,
well, given that the Attorney-General has indicated the government has no wish to embed the accountability mechanism in this Act, I will now read into the Hansard the second amendment, our fourth amendment, but the second amendment to this section, and that amends section 11 as follows. By inserting the following subsection after subsection 2. E, the committee shall consider and report upon every contract proposed to be entered into under this section, that where the duration of estimated cost of the contract exceeds 1 year or $20 million respectively. F, no contract to which subsection E applies shall be entered into unless it has first been referred to and reported upon by the committee in accordance with this section. G, the committee shall, with all convenient dispatch, deal with the matter and shall, as soon as conveniently practicable, regard being had to the nature and importance of the proposed work, report to the House of Assembly and Legislative Council if the House of Assembly or Legislative Council is then in session, and if not, to the Governor, the result of their inquiries. H, if a report under subsection G of this section if in a report under subsection G of this section, the committee does not recommend entering into a contract to which the report relates, that contract shall not be entered into unless and until it has been authorised by an Act. And again, Madam Speaker, it's pretty clear to me that there's no appetite to ensure you've got that scrutiny in this legislation. Not reassured by the Attorney-General's response to the first amendment we put in this section. It is disappointing that what we're doing here in the legislation is saying to the THS, off you go, enter into contracts with whoever you feel it is necessary to enter into contracts with. There's no restrictions there. We're telling them that it doesn't have to be consistent with the ministerial charter. It's not specified. It doesn't have to be consistent with a service plan. And it would, but for this section, otherwise not be authorised under the Act. Again, why wouldn't we just put in this legislation that check back to the Public Accounts Committee? It just baffles me. Is it because it's a Greens amendment, or because this government is still allergic to the measure of scrutiny that is required even in an emergency period? And in fact, even more so in an emergency period when we don't have regular parliamentary oversight, when the Subordinate Legislation Committee is not doing the work we were told it would be doing, that is, rigorous oversight of the emergency measures that have been taken. So I'm very disappointed that these amendments are not being accepted. I think it makes the Act weaker, and it doesn't reassure us that there will be enough checks and balances and transparency, line of sight to spending decisions as a result of this clause.
The question.
Well, in relation
Attorney?
to, Ms O'Connor moved a further amendment to that, so I just wanted to speak to that proposed.
Move it.
No, she just indicated it, did she?
I haven't moved it.
Sorry.
Because they live together. You can't have one without the other. So seeing as you've killed the first one, I'm just telling you what we would have done with the second one.
which means...
So the question is...
I can speak again.
Oh, yes, you want to. Yes.
Slightly quick off the mark there. I just wanted to say that the proposed amendments to Clause 11 of the bill would unnecessarily add significant time to the procurement process in an emergency declaration period. I just want to stress that I know that you're not moving that.
It's very clear that it has to be done quickly.
I want to make it very clear that this is for an emergency period. The time that it would take to submit a proposal to Public Accounts Committee and have it approved would be pretty untenable.
It could be turned around within a week, and you know it.
The purpose of the provisions in the... Well, not with my knowledge of Public Accounts.
It could be.
Committee. The purpose of the provisions in Clause 11 is to put in place appropriate mechanisms for emergency periods to allow the THS being able to provide support to the private sector in order to assist them, as I said, not only to keep their doors open, but to maintain their capacity to provide medical services to Tasmanians in the circumstances created by the COVID-19 emergency. It is not envisaged that THS would be providing a service doing a thing that it does not already do within public hospitals, but Part 3 of the bill will allow the THS to do those things as a contractor to assist private providers to continue service delivery. The need for these amendments is that these contracts and arrangements are required in very short timeframes, and the additional burden of going through a Public Accounts Committee review defeats this purpose in emergency.
No, it doesn't.
In emergency situations like this.
It doesn't. The default
one-year
is always
threshold-
secrecy with you people.
The one-year threshold, Madam Chair, is particularly problematic. While it is unlikely in current circumstances, it is foreseeable that a contract could extend beyond the emergency declaration period.
That's right.
The issue is that you could enter a
So it
contract
should be
on
looked at
terms
by
that could
Public
run on a
Accounts.
month-to-month basis that could, if the emergency continues, trip up on these thresholds after they've been otherwise validly entered into. The purpose of Part 3 is to enable the THS to move quickly to provide support to a private provider.
they
It is
already
simply
could.
allowing the THS the same freedom to act as the Crown. The proposed amendments create a greater layer of red tape in a time of emergency
You call
that would
scrutiny
exist
red
if we were
tape?
not dealing
Order.
with COVID-19. So according...
Breathtaking admission.
No, it's not a breathtaking
You call
admission.
scrutiny
Order,
Public
please.
Accounts Committee
The
red
Greens
Ms.
have
O'Connor,
very much changed
order,
their
please.
commentary today from what we heard previously from them.
What?
Well,
That's rubbish.
there has been substantial recognition by this House, and rightly so, that we are in extraordinary times, unprecedented.
It doesn't
times.
mean you
They are
abandon
challenging
parliamentary scrutiny.
They are times that none
doesn't
of us have
mean you
ever
can do
experienced
that.
before. And no, it's not a rubber stamp to do everything.
You are abandoning
but it
scrutiny
is.
here.
But we do need to take practical measures to ensure that our services operate.
That's
that we
right.
Keep them operating.
Absolutely.
And particularly,
Couldn't agree more.
particularly our medical services. So with that, Madam Chair, and I'm conscious of time, so accordingly the government will not be supporting these amendments.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Those against, to the contrary, say no. No. The noes have it.
Well, I feel so strongly about this one, Madam Speaker. I won't be dividing on them all, but divide, please.
Division required. What did I say after that? Ring the bells.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to, the committee will divide.
Yeah.
Don't say House and committee will divide.
No. No. Well, it's division. I don't know whether... You're happy? Are the whips happy? No. The whips are happy? So the whips are happy? Yeah, you're happy. Stop the bells, lock the doors. The question is that the amendment be agreed to. The committee will divide the ayes to the right of the chair and the noes to the left. And I appoint Ms. Haddad as clerk for the ayes, and who have I got? Ms. Petrusa as clerk for the noes. You're doing the ayes.
Sorry.
That's all. That's all. Thanks, Steve.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. The result of the division is ayes 7, noes 9. The noes have it. The question is that the clause as read stand part of the bill. Those of that opinion say aye. Those against, no. The ayes have it. Where to next? Oh, so Shane. Well, we don't know.
Clause 20.
Clauses 11 to 19.
The question is that the clauses as read stand part of the bill. Those in favour say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. The ayes have it.
Clause 20, Emergency Management Act, Principal Act.
Leader of the Greens.
Madam Chair, I move that a new clause I be inserted.
New clause, sorry, I just missed that. Aye.
The following new clause be inserted after clause 20. I, section 60A amended, and that is section 60A of the Emergency Management Act of 2006. Section 60A of the Principal Act is amended as follows. A, by inserting in subsection 1 before the definition of personal information the following definition: emergency cessation day has the same meaning as in the COVID-19...
Excuse me, Ms O'Connor, apparently I have to deal with clause 20 first.
Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah.
Yes. The question is that the clause as read stand part of the bill. Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. The ayes have it.
Very quickly, the following new clause, I move that the following new clause be inserted after clause 20. I, section 60A amended. Section 60A of the Principal Act is amended as follows. A, by inserting in subsection 1 before the definition of personal information the following definition: emergency cessation day has the same meaning as in the COVID-19 Disease Emergency Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2020. And B, by inserting the following subsection after subsection 2. 3, this section is repealed on the emergency cessation day. Madam Speaker, our understanding on passing the COVID-19 Disease Emergency Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 2020 was that the provisions in their entirety were temporary and tied to the emergency cessation day. Of course, it now transpires that that was not the case. I do believe in my discussions with the Premier that that was his understanding too. We don't believe the government should have an issue with this amendment. Our amendment repeals the section 60A inserted by the COVID-19 Disease Emergency Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2020 on the emergency cessation day as defined by the COVID-19 Disease Emergency Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 2020. Section 60A of the Emergency Management Act allows for the overriding of the Personal Information Protection Act 2004 during an emergency period. This was passed in a bill that was forced on the Parliament at short notice, and we are concerned that our belief that these changes were temporary it has not in fact transpired to be true. If the government wishes to make this provision permanent, Madam Chair, truly they should attempt an amendment at a later date and consult the public and have a full and proper debate on the subject. Madam Speaker, the last piece of legislation, the last piece of COVID legislation we debated, suspended the application of the Personal Information Protection Act during the emergency without public consultation, and it suspended it permanently. That is of enormous concern. We cannot allow an emergency to lead to the erosion of the rights of Australians and Tasmanians. We can't allow this emergency to provide cover for the erosion of the right to privacy and the protection of our personal information without a full and proper public debate about it. This is about the protection of personal information, and we understand that in an emergency you need to give maximum flexibility to health authorities, to law enforcement authorities and to government to make sure that they have access to the information that can keep people safe. We accept that, and that's why we supported the change reluctantly in the first COVID bill. Now it transpires, after a couple of weeks of us trying to find out whether or not it was permanent, that it is a permanent change. So there's been a permanent erosion of the protection of people's personal information under cover of an emergency response. That is very concerning. We believe that provision should expire on the emergency cessation day, and if it's deemed necessary for future emergencies, bring it back in here as a standalone amendment, consult on a draft bill and talk to people who are affected. when their right to privacy and the protection of their personal information is taken away by a parliament. We are very concerned that this is a permanent change. It wasn't flagged with us as a permanent change. It's taken more than a week for us to extract from the Attorney-General that it was a permanent change.
Don't say
So
I apologise for the delay. We're in extraordinary circumstances.
Okay, I take that back unreservedly.
Yeah,
But it did take a week for us to find out whether or not it was a permanent change. It is. It can't be justified without a proper public debate. So we want this provision to expire on the emergency cessation day, and then, if it's necessary, in the Emergency Management Act, let's have public consultation. I know, quaint, slightly old-fashioned, but it does make for better law, Madam Speaker, and it means that you build trust in the community about the decisions that are being made by Parliament, and trust in the community that the decisions are being made in their best interests.
Attorney?
Madam Chair, can I just clarify, and I did make this very, very clear in the debate and my summing up in the second reading speech. There does appear to be some confusion regarding this suspension of the PIP Act in relation to the COVID-19 emergency and other declared emergencies. As I said during the debate, I can reassure members and all Tasmanians for that matter that the PIP Act continues to apply. It's not been completely suspended at all. It continues to apply to collection, use and disclosure of personal information except in very limited circumstances during a state of emergency. And I went through and I clarified and I explained exactly what occurs in this situation and in relation to what was mentioned in the second reading speech when the COVID-19 Disease Emergency Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2020 applied. The proposed amendment by Ms O'Connor would see section 60A of the Emergency Management Act 2006 being repealed on the emergency cessation day defined in the first COVID Emergency Act, to which I just referred. The new section 60A inserted into the Emergency Management Act 2006 by the COVID-19 Disease Emergency Miscellaneous Provisions Act 2020 provides that certain provisions of the Personal Information Protection Act 2004, the PIP Act, do not apply to the sharing of personal information by certain bodies or persons performing functions or powers under the Act, the Public Health Act 1997 or another state or Commonwealth Act relating to the management of an emergency or public health, where personal information is requested, required, obtained, disclosed or used during a state of emergency. The circumstances of the COVID-19 emergency are unique and unprecedented. This emergency is not constrained within Tasmania. It's affecting all of Australia and indeed most of the world. It is also unusual in that it is a public health emergency that heavily involves agencies other than health in the response. As a consequence of these unique and unfolding circumstances, certainty was wanted for frontline workers that needed to share information between departments and with other states and the Commonwealth that they were not acting in breach of the law. For example, if an individual returned from overseas and was subject to an isolation requirement, that information could be passed to another department or to another state if the person left Tasmania, so that isolation requirement could be enforced. I think the House should spare a thought for that very practical implication if this wasn't in place. There are already exemptions in the Act for sharing information, but given the immediate nature of the initial response and the genuine need, and I say genuine, I stress the word genuine need, to share personal information, the government simply sought to protect frontline staff who were, and I'll say it again, genuinely responding to the emergency requirements in the interests of public health and safety. And for that reason, the government will not be supporting this.
Madam Chair, we recognise the genuine need for authorities to be able to share information that keeps people safe. But the Attorney-General herself said it. These are unique and uncertain circumstances. So what we're dealing with, Madam Speaker, is a point in time that is a pandemic emergency where for these circumstances, Parliament, when it passed the first bill, agreed that the Personal Information Protection Act could be suspended to enable health authorities particularly, but working with law enforcement authorities, to be able to exchange information about people in order to contact trace and other measures that need to be taken to keep people safe. So the Attorney-General herself said it. These measures, the amendment in the first Act, was about this point in time, this emergency, this pandemic. But what we've got here is an erosion of people's right to have their personal information protected. It is because it's become a permanent provision in the Emergency Management Act. So the Attorney-General did not make the argument for extending the suspension of the Personal Information Protection Act.
You must have listened to my...
I listened to every word you said.
No, I must not.
Well, okay. You made an argument. Respectfully, you made an argument, but it wasn't persuasive. So I can see what's happening here, Madam Speaker and Madam Chair, and it doesn't engender trust, Attorney, when we came in here in good faith on that first bill and we did everything we could to get it through and to make sure government had the powers that it needed to keep people safe and respond to the emergency. And in good faith, we supported the suspension of PIP in the Emergency Management Act. But we were led to believe in the briefing and in the second reading that it was a temporary change, that was a direct response to the emergency situation that we're in. But it's not. It's a permanent change now to the Emergency Management Act, and there's been no reference back, Attorney, to the people that this will affect most. People whose personal information will become somewhat less secure, potentially, in their minds in the future, not just for the pandemic emergency. I don't want to think that this has been done dishonestly or stealthily. In fact, I refuse to allow myself to go there in these circumstances. But what we've got here is a permanent capacity for people's personal information to be exchanged between agencies of government in a way that it hasn't been before this emergency.
The question is that the new clause A be made part of the bill to follow clause 20. Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Those to the contrary, no.
Oh, no.
The noes have it.
Divide.
Division required.
You've got to divide
Bring
the
them-
important stuff, Mark.
bring the
That's why
bills.
we're here.
You said we'll do it on this one. We won't.
No, I said I won't do it on all.
That's not what I heard. It's not what I thought I heard. That's not what I thought.
No, I said I won't do it on all. But I will do it on this. Just working that out. Yeah, so that was...
Whip's happy? You're happy? You're happy? Lock the doors. Sorry? You right? The committee will divide. Oh, the question is that the new clause A be made part of the bill to follow clause 20. The committee will divide, the ayes to the right, the noes to the left. I appoint Mr Street as teller for the noes, and for the ayes, Ms Woodruff. Dr Woodruff. There you go, Nick. The result of the division is ayes 2, noes 14. Therefore, the noes have it. Where to next, please?
Clause 21, section 60C inserted.
Yes.
Madam Chair,
Leader of the Greens.
I move that clause 21 is amended as follows. A, by inserting in subsection 1 before the definition of infringement offence, the following definition. Emergency cessation day has the same meaning as in the COVID-19 Disease Emergency Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 2020. B, by inserting the following subsection after subsection 6, 7, this section is repealed on the emergency cessation day. Now, Madam Chair, the rationale put forward for Tasmania Police to be able to issue infringement notices is a very strong one. It's a very strong one. And we support it for the duration of the emergency because it will mean that for some people it will avoid a much heftier penalty and potentially an appearance in court. But again, it is a change to the Emergency Management Act that gives police new powers. And when we're giving any law enforcement agency, even one with a culture that is robust and good, as Tasmania Police, that we provide, that we have a public debate about it, and that there is check and balance in there. So we are moving that the infringement issuing powers of Tasmania Police expire on the emergency cessation day, and it reflects our concern that the legislation we passed 3.5 weeks ago, we were told that it was only in response to the emergency, and we find out that there are permanent changes that have been made without public consultation, without any debate publicly, actually. So again, we believe that these powers should expire on the emergency cessation day, and if there is a strong argument for them becoming public, then let's have some public consultation and let's have a debate about it, Madam Speaker. That's how you make good law, Madam Speaker. So I move the amendment.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to seek some clarification. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I shared some of those concerns about the enduring nature of making this change and arming police with the ability to issue infringement notices to people for offences under the Emergency Management Act permanently outside of the period of the emergency period that we're in now. I acknowledge that the Attorney gave several answers during the debate and we're on a time limit now, so I just wanted to seek a little bit of clarification while recognising, of course, that those offences are very serious offences and they carry with them serious penalties for good reason, and we support the fact that those serious offences exist and that they with them carry serious penalties. But of course it is a departure from how things are currently undertaken in terms of the long-term effects of these potential changes. There is still the capacity, if these changes were to cease on the cessation day, for police to still arrest and charge people for offences under that. And I just wanted to seek clarification from the Attorney. In your comments earlier in the debate, you said that it would be possible for someone issued with an infringement notice to challenge that notice in court. But I was speaking to one of my colleagues from the Upper House who informed me that her understanding of the Upper House briefing received yesterday was that in fact the process for challenging an infringement order or contesting an infringement notice issued by a police officer would be to write to the commander during a period of emergency. So I just wanted to clarify which of those is the case. Thanks.
When you get something like that. Yeah, that's true. It's going to be a cold day. I was going to get the Android surgery. Got a 40th day in a row.
Okay, so I'll just deal with that issue first, because I think it's easier to answer. So that's the administrative right that you just mentioned is in addition to the right to go to the court. So they have an administrative avenue and
judicial review as well.
And they have a court avenue as well. Just in relation to the proposed amendment by Ms O'Connor, that would see the ability to issue infringement notices under the Emergency Management Act 2006 cease at the end of the emergency, as she said. What this emergency has shown us, and I did say this during my second reading speech summing up, what it's shown us is that a power to issue infringement notices to enforce restrictions during an emergency is desirable. We are now over 6 weeks into the current emergency and do not yet have that ability. As a result, it is desirable that the authority be enduring so that it is there for the next emergency should we require it. Should we have another emergency, we don't want to be fighting a rearguard action on the next occasion where we need Parliament to provide an authority after the emergency has started. And I think if this emergency has shown us anything, it is that we do need to be well prepared. And I'm a little bit surprised at this sort of amendment because I think the learnings from this experience should be taken on board. And we certainly, even today with the release of the health interim report, it is the learnings from these experiences that we need to take on board, to address for any future crises. or emergencies of this nature. So, although this is something that could be reviewed after this emergency, but in advance of any future one, an ability to issue an infringement notice isn't contentious. The offence will still exist, as I've previously said, regardless of this provision, and people can still be prosecuted regardless of this provision. An ability to issue an infringement notice just provides the police with another tool, as I've said, one that is likely to provide a more immediate effect in gaining compliance should they need it. But however, I know that their practice has been to take an educative approach, and that it doesn't also, I want to make this very, very clear, as I've just said to Ms Haddad in my answer, it doesn't take away any right of the person to whom it is issued. That person still has the option of having the alleged offence heard and determined by a court, but they also have the option of not having to go to court if they accept the infringement. And I did spend some time on that during the debate. The primary approach of police will continue to be educational. I know that they don't want to be having to issue these on-the-spot types of fines. However, you do get some people who don't heed the advice and the warnings and comply, as others have been. And so we do need to encourage compliance. Finally, it is worth pointing out that the infringement notice provision is only in relation to the Emergency Management Act 2006, and that an offence under the Act and an ability to issue an infringement notice would only exist where the Act is in operation. This is not the case day to day, and consequently there is no risk of the provisions being utilised outside of an emergency response under the Act.
The question is...
Thank you. Attorney, thank you for that explanation. Can I just understand the reasoning that you've given? Can you help us to understand how many times the Act has been in operation since it was first created in 2006? Just to give an indication of how frequently these powers might be required to be used based on historical usage.
Port Arthur.
Yeah, just trying.
Port Arthur, I think, was an emergency.
Weren't they saying earlier this is the first time something's happened over this?
I don't think so.
Tony?
We've had thank you, Madam Chair. We've had situations of alert under this Act, with bushfires.
Can you just speak?
We've had alert situations, but we haven't, to our knowledge, exercised the state of emergency. In fact, I'm sure we haven't. And I did say that in summing up as well, that we haven't exercised the state of emergency at all until now.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Just to go to the point of the amendment from the Honourable Member for Clark, the concern has been about whether or not these powers will remain permanently beyond and be used as a tool, but it seems that it's unlikely beyond the cessation of the state of emergency that they would be able to. It would just be an act with Parliament today to provide the preparedness powers, as you've indicated, so that if a state of emergency is declared, that the police service can respond immediately. So it's very unlikely that beyond the period of this emergency that they will be utilised again unless another state of emergency is declared. If you could perhaps address that, I think that would help us to feel comfortable with this.
I thought that I did make that clear in summing up. I'm very happy to confirm that that is the case. And I think members can be comforted by the fact that you do not call a state of emergency lightly. In fact, when we, as a government, were considering state of emergency, I know that it's one of those situations that you do as a very last resort option to ensure that you can respond as required in this type of emergency situation, because the state controller, for example, who has enormous powers, we all appreciate that and why, comes into play. And so it is something that is exercised in extraordinary circumstances, such as what we are experiencing at the moment. And we know that I don't think any of us have really got used to it, other than it becomes a little bit more routine as to the social distancing. But every so often it hits you the extent of how all Tasmanians and indeed Australians and across the world, how we're having to react to this emergency situation. It's quite extraordinary and unique.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for stepping through that. You can understand how important it is for us to be very clear about this.
Yeah, absolutely.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Those
Sorry.
those
Jump the gun.
sorry.
I jumped the gun.
To the contrary, no.
No.
The noes have it.
Clause 30?
Before that.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Clause 29, I need to vote against.
The question is that clause 21, as read, stand part of the bill. Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no.
No.
The ayes have it.
Clauses 22 to 28.
The question is the clauses as read, stand part of the bill. Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Those to the contrary, no. The ayes have it.
Clause 29, emergency cessation day.
Yes,
Attorney.
Madam Chair, I'll be very, very quick because I think Ms O'Connor has one more and mindful of time. As I said when I was moving the amendment to clause 3, that I foreshadowed that clause 29, as a consequence of changing that definition, was no longer required. So I will simply be voting against it. Great. I know that's unusual.
Except with our unprecedented times.
The question is that the clause as read stand part of the bill. Those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. No. The noes have it.
Clause 30, regulations.
Thank
Yes,
you,
leader
Madam
of the
Speaker.
Greens.
This is our, Madam Chair, this is our final proposed amendment. I move that clause 30 is amended as follows by inserting the following subsection after subsection 9. 10, it should say. This section is repealed on the emergency cessation day, and any regulations made under this Act are rescinded on the emergency cessation day. Madam Chair, we're uncomfortable with the broad scope of this clause. The regulatory powers are very significant, and they do not explicitly expire on the emergency cessation day. In the interests of being cooperative and recognising that some regulatory powers will be needed to administer this Act, we're prepared to amend this clause to cause the regulation-making powers to expire on the emergency cessation day and for regulations made under this Act to be rescinded on the emergency cessation day. Madam Chair, we were advised during the briefing, and I want to thank everyone who gave us that briefing yesterday afternoon, that due to the provisions of this Act being tied to the emergency cessation day, these regulation-making powers would effectively expire on the emergency cessation day, and that regulation-making powers would no longer be able to be used. If this is correct, and we have no reason to believe it's not, Madam Chair, there should be no objection to our amendment. The Greens are a bit wary about taking some of these assurances on trust after our experience with the first emergency powers bill. So I hope that this amendment will be accepted.
The Attorney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, I'm pretty sure I did actually use this in my notes for summing up, so I know that we've only got a few minutes left. So I just wanted to confirm the very basic principle that I stated, that it's not true that people other than the governor can make regulations, for example, the director. That wording only allows administrative matters to be determined by those persons. Doesn't extend to making regulations themselves. For that to occur, there would need to be specific wording to allow subdelegation of legislative power as opposed to a subdelegation of administrative power, which is what section 32B gives. It's not an unusual provision. clause 30, subclause 1 provides that the governor can make regulations under the Act. No other person can make regulations under the Act, and this is consistent with how regulation making powers are set out in other legislation. Now, I did go into this in more detail in my summing up and addressing the specific question that Ms O'Connor put during the second reading speeches, and I understand why she's moving this amendment. But for the sake of brevity, I will just refer to the comments that I made rather than read them all out again as to the reason why the government won't be supporting this amendment. Other than that, I don't think I have anything further to say other than what I said in some...
Well, perhaps by interjection, just in the interest of time saving, you could confirm that these making powers will expire on the emergency cessation day.
I wouldn't have thought it was that hard to answer that question. I know.
Tony?
The reason being that there are some provisions in this, for example, the taxi licences, that need to apply post this period, and some won't, some will.
Sorry, back to the original question. Can you confirm that this clause 30, with its regulation-making powers, will expire on the emergency cessation date?
The making of them.
The making of regulations under this.
Not how long the regs will run for, but the making.
Not the extension of the regs, because we understand.
Well, I think there's a misinterpretation here.
It's the power to make the regulations under this Act. Will they expire on the emergency cessation day?
Order. As the time is 6:30, the time for the debate has expired.
That is an extremely important question that the House should have had an answer to.
Order.
Speaker,
I'm just finishing my sentence, please. I will put the amendment. The question is that the amendment be agreed to. Those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Those to the contrary, no.
No.
The noes have it.
Well, Madam Speaker, divide. Because if the attorney had just been able to say to us they expire on the emergency cessation day, we wouldn't be concerned.
all right, we just needed one
What's going
second.
on?
She needed
But my
one
little
second.
alarm bells are going on.
What is going on?
Well, the minister's trying to help you here.
This is we're talking about the power, not the length that the regulations will be in place. Do you know what I mean? Do you understand the distinction I'm making?
Leader of the Greens, I don't have any discretion. Are you asking for a division?
Well, I'm just... we can avoid a division if the attorney could please answer the question.
It was in the middle of getting the answer to
But the House has ordered that the debate end at 6:30.
So, attorney, you don't want to answer that question?
It's not that I don't want to. There are forms of the House here.
Oh, well.
There's not a lot I can
which
do.
question?
Divide.
Yes or no?
Divide. All you have to say is, yes, those powers expire on the emergency cessation date.
Division required. Ring the bells.
What is that, Cassy? Nothing's as straightforward as you make it seem.
Well, if we had some
It's a
clarity...
pretty important thing to know the answer
Thank you, sir. Are the whips happy? Lock the doors. You're happy? Yeah. The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and the committee divide, the ayes to the right of the chairs and the noes to the left. I appoint Mr Street, the Honourable Member Street for the noes, and Dr Woodruff as teller for the ayes. Thank you. You'll get good at this. Thank you. How do I say that? So I've just been thinking about it.
So just declare the division as usual. And then the question is that the clause says read stand part of the bill, the remaining clause stand part of the bill,
Thank you. Yeah, sure. Above or below? Below? Above? The result of the division is ayes 7, noes 9. Therefore, the noes have it. The question is that the clause as read stand part of the bill, that the remaining clause stand part of the bill, and that I report the bill to the House with amendment. Those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it.